This is another paper that I'm putting in this collection, even though it's not directly from the collection itself, but it is closely related. This is about inequality and the biosphere. We always think about inequality in terms of, either poverty, economic inequality, or maybe poverty of information, access to information, and so on and so forth. But here it's a nice idea that they're saying actually there is a feedback between inequality and the biosphere, both ways. So let's read some of these points. And it fits into the whole evolutionary idea. If we have evolved along with the biosphere, biosphere has affected the atmosphere, we have affected the biosphere, biosphere affects us. There are all these feedbacks. So the key words here are global environmental change, multidimensional inequality, social ecological systems that we talked about in terms of the niches and the niche constructions. And of course, there are scales, feedbacks, and comes back to climate change. Rising inequalities and accelerating global environmental change pose two of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. Sorry. To explore how these phenomena are linked, we apply a social ecological systems perspective and review the literature to identify six different types of interactions or pathways between inequality and the biosphere. We find that most of the research so far has only considered one directional effects of inequality on the biosphere or vice versa. However, given the potential for complex dynamics between socioeconomic and environmental factors within social ecological systems, we highlight examples from the literature that illustrate the importance of cross-scale interactions, and feedback loops between inequality and the biosphere. This is critical. It's not just socioeconomic. However, the inequality is created, whatever was the cause, how does it interact then with the biosphere? Or however the biosphere is affected, how does it affect inequality? The review draws on diverse disciplines to advance a systematic understanding of the linkages between inequality and the biosphere, specifically recognizing cross-scale feedbacks and the multidimensional nature of inequality. Well, I'm obviously going to be brief as usual, and you can go back and read. It's a very nice paper. I love reading those, but when you put them into podcasts, you have to somehow synthesize it. Obviously, there's a lot of objective, you know, choices made. Inequality is one of the key social challenges of our time with far-reaching ramifications for human well-being, our ability to stay active, energetic, and be innovative, part of the teams, solutions, actions. Similarly, unprecedented and accelerating changes to the biosphere have the potential to significantly impact societies across the planet. In this article, we show that far from being independent, inequality and the biosphere interact in many different ways. We review the research across a range of disciplines that we already said, six pathways. So we go beyond the one-way interaction. We aim to address this need for a broader consideration of interactions between inequality and the biosphere by taking a social ecological systems perspective, which is based on older paper, which is inherently interdisciplinary and emphasizes that there is a dynamic interplay between the biosphere and socioeconomic variables such as inequality. Within this framework, we review the scientific literature to explore and describe pathways in which changes in the biosphere impact inequality in society, as well as pathways in which inequality impacts the biosphere. So the pathways obviously have to cover numerous spatial, temporal, and institutional scales because we are now running institutions at various scales, including the efforts by the UNFCCC and other UN agencies for international or global governance crossing boundaries and so on. So there are many ideas on knowledge gaps, pathways for future research, and so on that I'm going to mostly skip because they tend to be, again, authors' perspectives. What is inequality? This is worth reading. In 1754, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau defined what he termed moral inequality as the unequal distribution of privileges between people resulting from prevailing institutions, norms, and beliefs. An unequal distribution of privileges can occur in many different areas of life, which the 2016 World Social Science Report refers to as The seven dimensions on inequality: economic, political, environmental, social, cultural, spatial, and knowledge-based information poverty. These inequalities invariably intersect and potentially reinforce each other. For example, uh, economic and knowledge inequalities often intersect with political inequality, as low income and education levels hamper the capacity of people to engage in decision making processes. This is very critical. Our definition of inequality focuses on inequality as a positive description of the variance in the distribution of a resource. In contrast, concepts such as wealth and poverty provide a positive description of the level of resources available. You can read what that means. On the basis of these definitions, economic inequality can be high in a wealthy nation where most people live in a certain, above a certain poverty line, or low in an impoverished country. So, you have to see whether economic inequality captures the complete dimension of inequality, all dimensions of inequality. Although this distinction is important in an academic setting, inequality and poverty are often conflated in everyday use, and some commentators consider the percentage of people living below a certain poverty line to represent a measure of economic inequality in society, which misses the other dimensions that we talked about: political, environmental, social, cultural, spatial, knowledge based, and so on. So, this is kind of a heuristic argument: wealthy and high inequality, then you have extreme poverty tail end here. But if you go to wealthy and low inequality, then the extreme poverty is missing. If you have poor and high inequality, then the distribution itself is shifted towards the left in terms of wealth on a theoretical scale, but now the tail is much fatter, and this is extreme poverty here. And if you have poor and low inequality, you can still have large percentage of population which is above the extreme poverty, which is still a hypothetical line, but heuristically you can understand that here the tail is smaller, whereas the inequality is lower, but here tail is smaller, but the inequality is higher. So it's like saying poor people in America are better off than poor people in Africa or Asia. That doesn't make sense because you're poor based on what you can access in your system: politics, environment, knowledge, etc. Right? So inequality in nature also exists. Inequality is not restricted to a society but occurs throughout the biosphere. For purposes of this review, we define the biosphere broadly as the global ecological system integrating all living beings and their relationships in the thin layer of life between the Earth's crust and the outer space. The biosphere is naturally unequal, meaning that there exists an inherent environmental or resource heterogeneity across the globe and within regions or countries as well. For example, not all places on Earth are equally endowed with access to energy resources, even if they are renewable, like solar and wind, or freshwater reserve. You could be living in a desert or a wet place and still have access problems, or appropriate biophysical conditions for large scale agricultural production. Early in human history, these differences in initial endowments of natural resources led to an inequality of opportunity for societal development and economic expansion in different parts of the globe. Okay, a social ecological systems perspective, just briefly. The social ecological systems perspective considers the biosphere and human well being to be inherently and inextricably intertwined and co evolving. People are not only embedded in and completely dependent on the biosphere, but they are also influencing it more from microscopic to planetary scale. Social ecological systems are complex and adaptive, characterized by variables that interact through amplifying or dampening feedbacks across scales in space, time, and organizational hierarchy. These cross-scale dynamics can result in novel and nonlinear behavior that may cause surprising shifts in the way the system uh, is structured and functions. So, in terms of all the other papers we've been reading from the collection on the Anthropocene, obviously this doesn't consider evolutionary aspects. What are our evolutionary traits that are either uh, mitigating or amplifying these interactions between the biosphere and inequalities? right? Obviously, the evolutionary traits are a big part of it in terms of our, intergroup competition or intragroup cooperation and how that affects how pro-social behavior and cooperation interact and so on and so forth. So everything is related, and yet this is cast in a way that is devoid of any evolutionary aspects. But we have to cover, connect them in our head. Changes in the biosphere lead to changes in inequality, obviously. And if we have become better and better at exploiting resources and adapting to the changes we make to the environment in the meantime and make more exploitations, then inequality can keep growing, even within this evolutionary niche construction and feedbacks that we have, the ratcheting effect that we talked about. Changes in the biosphere lead to changes in inequality. Inequalities between groups of people may be exacerbated or diminished by changes in the biosphere, both by sudden and abrupt changes as extreme weather events and other environmental shocks, but also by more incremental changes in key biophysical variables such as climate patterns and species distributions. Okay, some general points. This is another nice heuristic feedback kind of idea. Here is the biosphere, here is the society. If you go back to Herman Daly and the economic ideas, then should biosphere really be separate from society, or should we all be sitting within the environment or the biosphere? So that's another normative question, and in fact has a huge implication for sustainability and how we think about it. Should we always focus on economic development and then worry about the biosphere? Or should we remember that we are in the biosphere and the more we exploit, the less space there is in the biosphere and so on. So inequality sits here with actions, relating to perceptions and fairness. So even the perception of equality can help the, pro-social behavior, especially among the poor. Aspirations, humans are basically an aspirational species. We are always trying to go bigger. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? That affects the biosphere. Of course, collaboration, can we really collaborate only at small groups or can we collaborate globally? And market concentrations, which is another dimension that obviously affects uh, the inequalities in a great way. And that depends on the biosphere. If you are, uh, blessed with a lot of natural resources and in terms of the biosphere, then you can corner the market. Why would you think about inequality when you're trying to sell things and make money from the natural resources you have been given or you have occupied over evolutionary timescales? What are the impacts? Of course, gradual environmental change like the chronic changes in warming and shifts in rainfall patterns and so on, and environmental shocks or acute stressors like cyclones and so on and so forth. So all these are going to affect society and biosphere and of course inequality with these feedbacks. So that's basically the idea of the inequalities effect on biosphere. So you can think of these as inequalities effect on the biosphere. And of course, biosphere then responds by kicking you back in the ass to remind you that you did something, even though poor people may not have done it, right? So a sense of fairness can also be influential in environmental decision making at a global level. The real and perceived economic and political inequalities between industrialized and developing countries are significant factors in climate policy negotiations with far reaching repercussions for the environment. For example, heightened tensions and mistrust between the developed and developing nations were a major contributor to the failure of the Copenhagen Accord of 2009 to limit greenhouse gas emissions, undermining the potential to commit countries to a binding agreement and avoid catastrophic climate change. When rich countries are unlikely to consider fairness or take part in redistribution efforts, poorer nations are not willing to compensate for wealthier nations' inaction. So there is a certain action that becomes necessary, let's say adaptation to the impacts you're having, or managing your energy with renewables because you don't have resources, but that still doesn't bring collaborations between poor countries and rich countries. So cooperation then in sustaining local commons is very, very critical. And we've talked a lot about this in terms of adaptation and sustaining the commons in my other course. Basically, the idea of Eleanor Ostrom is that norms and punishments can be set up, and cooperation in sustaining the local commons have many successful examples. And as she admits, climate change and biosphere society inequalities are now a global scale issues, require global collective action, and the whole series here is discussing whether we are even capable of that and whether our evolutionary traits uh, are a barrier to this collective action. Okay, so few cooperations or participation studies investigate a direct link between inequality in groups and pro-environmental behavior. Instead, the focus is on understanding the link between inequality and cooperation, with the implicit assumption that cooperation leads to sustainable resource use or improved environmental sustainability. So, in this context here, they want to see whether inequality is going to inhibit cooperation, even within a group, even at a local scale? And if so, how does it affect the local common in terms of sustaining it? And of course, it will cascade into larger and larger scale. So I'm running through this because there are incredibly good points being made, but I'm going to be very brief. I hope you get the idea, the main idea that there is a huge interaction between the biosphere and inequality, and it's not just economic. Okay. Discussion, insights across fields and remaining research gaps. It's a long discussion, but I'm going to cut it down to two paragraphs that open this discussion. In this review, we highlight examples from the literature in which changes in the biosphere impact inequality and those in which inequality affects the biosphere. We identify six different pathways for these interactions within the framework of social ecological systems, ranging from the direct impacts of environmental shocks on inequality in society to the more indirect effect of perceived inequalities on pro-environmental behavior. So poor people like to feel that the world is equal and doesn't punish them and doesn't favor the rich for increasing their pro-social behavior, as we saw. We show that the far-reaching impacts of global environmental change are already exacerbating inequalities at local and regional scales. We know that. And that inequalities between people, corporate actors, and nations can significantly affect the way in which natural resources are managed and used. Okay, that's obvious as well, but some details are there in section 3.2. Importantly, the social ecological systems perspective allows us to identify examples where these interactions form feedback loops, such as the case of Hurricane Katrina. Poor people got displaced and some didn't have a choice of leaving. Rich people left and they're not coming back, which affects local economy, employment, everything, and its lasting exacerbations of inequality, because if rich people don't come back, tax base goes down, then improvements may not happen. Similarly, Hurricane Mitch, and then those are two cases from the Western Hemisphere, but there are many across. In conclusion, the pathways outlined here are a first step towards a more systemic, cross-scale, and multidimensional understanding of interactions between inequality and the biosphere. We need to understand this better. Future research will need to explore these and other pathways further, as well as analyze the many context-specific differences in outcomes for both inequality and the environment. Increasing the discussion of inequality within environmental research, elevating it to equal importance as average economic outcomes, and going beyond standard economic assessment tools would begin to address the many knowledge gaps identified. You have to read the details. Similarly, research on inequality should explicitly consider environmental drivers and feedbacks along with more established economic mechanisms. Moreover, it's crucial that we identify institutions that can deal with the scale of the challenge of understanding and addressing inequality in the context of a rapidly changing and increasingly connected planet. That's the idea of whether evolution will ever allow us to have collective action for sustainability. New approaches that recognize the inherent connectedness of inequality and the biosphere, the multidimensional nature of inequality, as well as the potential for cross-scale feedbacks and thresholds are needed to confront the world's dual challenge of rising inequalities and accelerating global environmental change. Of course, biggest challenge being that we need to get past these and bring about collective action at global scale, which we may not be evolutionarily uh, inclined to do. So how do we bring about that? So summary points, inequality is one of the 21st century's most pressing challenges, and it is mainly considered to be a socio-economic issue in the traditional literature. Even this paper review looked at biosphere interaction with inequality, but didn't consider any of the evolutionary traits that we actually should always consider. However, inequality and the biosphere interact in many important ways given the intertwined nature of social ecological systems and the far-reaching impacts of global environmental change. Using a social ecological systems approach, we identify different pathways of interaction. Firstly, the biosphere impacts inequality in society through shocks or extreme events, as well as through gradual environmental change, what we call chronic change and acute stressors. Inequality has an effect on the biosphere through human actions, of course, which can be shaped by an individual's perception and sense of fairness, as well as their aspirations. So this is where evolutionary aspects come in really strongly. Beyond the individual, inequality can influence the actions of groups or institutions by shaping cooperation in sustaining the local commons or through market concentration. Again, these are heavily dependent on how we have evolved to cooperate at local scale, compete, intra-group, and be even environmentally friendly within the group or a country or a state, but compete with other states, even neighbors, without worrying about environmental impacts. Okay, so sorry for rushing through, but it's a fantastic paper. Please go and read. I have to run to another meeting. That's why also I'm rushing a bit. I do these in between lots of other things, but I am so eager to do it because before I forget the paper that I read, I must capture the important points. Okay. Also, I'm excited about these ideas beyond just climate change, CO2, greenhouse gases, extreme events. These are the critical points I think that we are missing. I hope you like them anyway. See you.